on our list, the 16th gate and the 9th gate. And the 16th gate, again, in the throat center, and you can see as we're moving through all these throat center gates, all these articulating gates, all those voices that come out of the throat. And of course, the 16th gate is the gate of enthusiasm. It is the gate of skills. Recognize that that's the gate of articulating skills. You know, it is about being skillful in the way in which you express yourself and skillful in the way in which you express logic. Many people think that because the 1648 is called the channel of talent, that this is the only place where talent is. You have to understand this word talent in this context. It has nothing to do with... It has nothing to do with being creative. It has everything to do with being disciplined. Everything to do with being disciplined. The 1648 is about practicing. It isn't about creating. Right? And for talent to be honed, it's 99% practice. So this is what the talent is all about. But don't confuse it with creativity, because creativity is a logical process. So when you're dealing with the 16th gate, the 16th gate has a problem. And the problem that it has is that it is a direct connection to the 48th gate. That's the problem. And the 48th gate is the fear of inadequacy. And it is one of the most difficult fears for the logical process. There is nothing that logic is more frightened of in that a pattern is inadequate. Because the moment a pattern is inadequate, it means that the future is at risk. And of course, everything about the logical process is to ensure that everything in the future is going to be rosy. You know? Here's a safe pattern. Here's a reliable pattern. If we follow this pattern, everything is going to be okay. The other thing about any collective gate, is to see that its fundamental theme as a circuit is rooted in the keynote of sharing. You know, when you look at the chart in terms of its social context, what you see is that the tribe, for example, has two specifically social channels, the 59-6, the 40-37. That individuality has one specific social channel, the 12-22. But the collective, there are no social channels. They're all social. They're compulsively social, you know. That's why we have troubles with, 18s, you know. Let me share with you my criticism of you. Gee, thanks. That's just what I wanted today, you know? So the 16, it always wants to share its skills with you. It wants to share the verbalization of the pattern with you. And of course, what it's afraid of is that it's not going to be good enough. Now, there is a theme to the 16th gate that is very, very important. The 16th gate carries with it the theme of identification. There is no other gate that carries such an intense theme of identification. If you go to, some boo-boo baba in India, they will say to you, do not identify, And if you have the 16th gate, you have a big problem, right? Because if you have the 16th gate, you are intended to identify. And the deeper you identify with whatever it is, you have to identify with the pattern. You can see that because if you get to the 16-6, you get to propaganda. How can we get them to identify to a pattern that's a lie? Isn't that nice? Aren't we clever creatures? Anyway, identification. So when you're looking out at the world and you've got 16 eyes, you see whether or not identification is at work out there. Are people identified with, their government, their environment, social causes, are they identified in their relationships, all these identification things. This is what the 16 is looking at. And you see, what it's trying to see is, where is the inadequacy? You know? Where has the identification failed? Or where is there over-identification, the cult of personality? You know? Everybody dresses like Mao. You know? So the 16 has an unusual way of looking out at the world. And when you're looking at that, because it's under the theme of talent, and if you look at both the 48 and the 16, you will see the kinds of things that move the collective. Trivia, as an example, propaganda, as an example, you know, fairy tales, stories, all of these things, that the 16 is always trying to see how to get people to be better identified. They can end up being superb propagandists. Yeah? But there's something else. You know, I have always sent my children to music classes. Yeah? Always. Eh? I mean, that's my conditioning. Everybody in my family learned how to play instruments. We all learned how to make music. And music's a wonderful thing, and I love it. So I send my kids to music classes. And it's hilarious, you know, because you see, if you're not identified with doing something, it doesn't happen. If you don't see yourself as a musician on stage, it's something in my eye, you don't see yourself as a musician on stage. You know, if you can't identify with the life and the whole process, it's not going to happen. You're never going to practice. You don't practice unless you're identified. You have to identify with it. You have to be totally in it. In it. And so I watch, and you know, you get to see. You know, they'll go to the class. I pay for the class. They come home. They all have keyboards and whatever. I never hear them practice. And I don't tell them to practice because they're generators. You know, I don't do that. You know, I asked them if they wanted the music lessons. They went, you know. If I ask them, do you want to practice? They go, you know. So what am I going to do? Nothing, you know. If you don't have the identification, you can't do anything. So the 16 looks out in the world, and this is why it's enthusiasm. It's collective. It can be very beautiful. I mean, if you look at some of the lines of the 16, you can see that here is the real ability to be able to enthuse others. You know, help them be identified. You know what is the greatest identifier? You know, the first time you take little Johnny or Jane, you know, and they get to give their first recital, you know, and they're 6 or 7 years old, and they do one of these little tiny things. And identification. Identification leads to practice. You know. The dilemma is always when identification lacks talent. I mean, creativity. That's another story, you know. I mean, I would rather have kids that don't practice than a kid that practices all the time and never gets better, right? That's horrifying. I mean, that's really scary, right? Anyway, so the 16 looks out in the world, and that's the way it sees it. On the other side, you have the 9. And of course, we're in a format energy. And this is one of those wonderful gates, the taming power of the small. I love that. But there's only 2 gates that tame. And you know, tame is when you take a wild thing and you domesticate it. Right? So it is a theme of manipulation and conditioning. So the taming power of the small is the conditioning capacity and manipulating capacity of little things. You also have the taming power of the great. We're getting there, 26th gate. Right? And the taming power of the great is the manipulation of the truth. That's another story. We'll get there. How do you tame the truth? Yes, sweet. Okay, so we go back to the 9. Chinese proverb, you know, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. This is the 9th gate. This is what taming power of the small is all about. That is, The fact is that if you have the focus to be able to deal with detail, you will ultimately get the larger reward. However, it's a boring process. This is the whole thing. This is the whole thing about talent. Remember, this is the format energy. The 9 is the format energy of eventually the 16. They're all part of the logical circuit. In order to get to that place that you can be properly identified, you have to be able to have the focus to work on the details. There are certain pieces of music that I've been playing for over 40 years. It seems like you can always play them again and hopefully do it better somehow. There is no ultimate perfection. There isn't. It doesn't exist. But all of those details, over the years, you begin to notice something. It's like, being a musician is a fascinating process. You start off being so concerned about what you're physically doing and end up being so concerned about what you're hearing. You leave the mechanical things behind because they become natural and you get into another realm. But you have to go through all the detail. You got to go through all the steps, and that's very, very boring unless you're identified. I can play my own songs over and over again, never get bored. Thank God. It would be horrendous, if I wasn't identified with the fact that they're mine, I love them, blah, blah, blah. You have to be identified. So this theme, the ninth gate sees, is there focus out there or not? Is there the attention span or not? If you don't have the attention span, forget it. If you don't have the ability to focus on the details, you can never express great talent. You can't. Everything about the logical process is the understanding that mechanical repetition leads to perfection. The only thing is that the perfection is not something you ever actually get to. You just get better. Hopefully. Nonetheless. And the thing that kills talent is the lack of identification. You see this in, there are people that will, go through very talented phases in their lives and suddenly it all falls apart. They stop being able to, they stop being receptors for the creative process. It doesn't seem to work anymore. It's a loss of identification. They didn't lose their talent. They just stopped being identified with it. And the moment you stop being identified with it, you stop practicing. And the moment you stop practicing, it's gone. It's so amazing. It's gone. So this 9 and the 16, they're talking about something very, very fundamental for all of us. And it's not about music. The collective represents, the logical collective represents the only thing that we can truly rely on for certain. There is nothing more important to a human being than the fact that we have logic. It's what makes human design something that is so powerful, is that it is logical. You can look into it, you can test it, you can check it, you can go through the steps, you can see the patterns. And you see this focus on the detail, this focus on the patterns, this is also leads to an identification with correct being. To be identified with who you are rather than being identified with who you are not. Being identified with what is fixed in you because that's what's worthy of your identification. Most human beings identify with what they're not. Because they're caught in that whole attraction business. But if you know the details, you can cut through all that. Because the details will show you over and over and over again what is really there. So you look out through the 9 and you look out into the world and you see that there is this capacity in humanity to be focused. But you also see that if you don't look after the little things, it all falls apart. This wonderful line, the 9-3. Oh, I love this line. The straw that breaks the camel's back. The overlooked minor element that predetermines failure. You can't get a stronger line. But it's not so much about what that affliction means to an individual. I mean, my eldest son has this line, and it simply means that he always forgets what he's supposed to do. It's very convenient to have the 9-3. But this straw, that breaks the camel's back, this little tiny, tiny thing, and happens all the time. If you don't have all the details, you don't see the truth. You can't. And the truth is relative, obviously. But whatever the relative truth of the pattern is, you need to have all the details. You need to have all the basic information. It's like me when I look at the schooling of children. There's something missing. Nobody teaches them how to live in the world. Nobody teaches our children how to live in the world. Nobody says to our children, finding out about who you are is more important than learning how to count. Nobody does that. I mean, after all, it seems to me that, along with the ABCs, that it would be really nice, to teach children who they are, give them a chance to operate correctly. It's basic, fundamental education. It's a detail, minor detail, that leads to this enormous destructive force that is the way human beings are conditioned, in the way in which they grow up, in the way in which they go into the world, and then hopefully, if you're lucky, 30, 40, 50 years later, something hits them in the head and they decide that they're going to finally be themselves. I mean, what a long trip. And part of identification is that if you really have the details, if you can really see what the details are, you can see what is worthy of identification. And remember, this is a collective sharing process. It's not for yourself. It is for all of humanity because this is the way the collective works. Let me tell you what you all need to be identified with. And then through that general enthusiasm, in fact, you can really change human beings. So this collective polarity, you're also looking out with collective eyes. You're looking to see where the sharing is out there. You're learning to see the whole collective from that perspective of identification and focus.
השראה, חלחלה.